Is this rolling? It's rolling. All right, check. 1, 2, check's good. Okay, this is the 40 ounce Hemlock Podcast, the antidote to academic poison, as it were. Maybe I should just call it the Academic Poison Podcast. Maybe that's a little bit catchier. I don't know. Whatever. This is. Oh, that was my hip. Sorry, I just ran 7 miles, and I'm a little bit creaky. Figure it was good to get some blood flowing before part 2. This is part 2 in 2 different senses. In the prior episode, I said that this is really the second part of a little series that I had an idea for when I saw this news service that feeds into my Firefox browser, this news service called getpocket.com. So I wanted to do was like a series on the various articles that I found, and I was going to be clever and call the series Pocket Dial because it was kind of random. Is that like the 8th time I've said that? I just want somebody to go, hey, that's kind of catchy, but it's not. So don't lie to me. I wanted to do a series on the articles that you find coming across your browser feed from, fed to you from this news service, because they're all of an ilk, and they're all of a concern to me as a former academic, a philosopher, a thinking person, a person who thinks a lot about how the way in which we think about ourselves as individuals is reflected at the political level, and how manipulation of us as a populace, as a people, as individuals, as families, as citizens, and so on and so forth, how that's done at the academic level for political purposes. Okay, that was a mouthful, but just ignore all that for a second. I said in the prior episode that, and by episode, I mean just prior to this one. Sorry, like I said, this is a part 2 in 2 different senses. This is part 2 of the second Pocket Dial, but this is also part B of part 2 of the second Pocket Dial. So the first one was a couple episodes back. I don't know, episode 43 or 44 or 45 or something like that. It was called The Science Writer and the Samurai. And this idea of the science writer and the cultural role that they play is something that is like a frequent refrain of mine. Okay? But this is part 2 of an episode called, ironically, All is One. So this is part 2 of All is One. So I guess that answers the question. Is all one? No, it's not. It's at least 2. There's this phenomenon called the philosophy joke, and I can never decide whether it's great. It's kind of like a dad joke. It's great and it's awful. Oh. And some people only get into philosophy so they can make awkward philosophy jokes. I might be guilty of that. No, I'm kidding. I'm in it I'm in it to win it. Okay. Look, I've had to break this episode into 2 parts. Okay. And before we get on with what we're doing here in this episode, I said in the last episode I was going to make a cup of tea, and here we are. It's a new day. Before we get on to this, I want to just revisit. I was on a run and I was playing something from YouTube while I was on a run, and I was like, look, okay, here's somebody else talking about this, so let me just reinforce so people don't think I'm like just talking out of my ass. I tend to talk kind of flippantly because I have real strong feelings and a lot of experience with this stuff, and I know where I stand on it, and I know to what effect this stuff, these bodies of inquiry, these domains of inquiry, these academic disciplines, I know to what effect they are used against you in the culture. Okay, so I'm pretty terse, I'm pretty frank about it. But I don't want to give the impression that I'm just talking out of my ass. So I'm just gonna play I'm just gonna play a clip that I was listening to. I was running today that sort of encapsulates the point that I was out to make at the beginning of yesterday's episode. Okay, and that point was, I said it 2 or 3 times in that episode. I'm going to say it again now. When someone says that all is one, how we interpret what they're saying is going to depend on what that person's view of existence is, or in the philosophical terms, that person's view of metaphysics. That person's view, and most people don't realize most people don't have a self-conscious view. You don't wake up in the morning and go, what kind of things do I think exist, right? But subconsciously, implicitly, people have a view. Like, you ever hear somebody say, well, I only believe in what I can taste, touch, smell, hear, and see. always forget one of the senses, right? That's a view about what exists. The only kinds of things that exist are material things, right? So when someone says all is one, how we interpret or understand the meaning of their statement is going to depend on what their view of existence is. Hey, dude, what kinds of things exist? Okay? Now, for the uninitiate, and I will tell you, the academics, look, I'm going to constantly pull the curtain back here. That's kind of my shtick. And it's not a shtick. It's shit. It's real shit. But academics love to have you as the uninitiate, because that means that they can confuse you and they can befuddle you and they can wow you and they can impress you with jargon and never really come to the point or address the point. Okay, they're very good, or make philosophy jokes and never really get to the heart of an issue. Okay, because it benefits them to be looked to for wisdom on these subjects. The problem is that they don't have any wisdom on these subjects. Okay, now you might say, well, that's a strong thing to say. These are people who studied it their whole life. Yeah, I know. Okay, I don't care. Just hear me out. You know, I know what I'm talking about. There's kind of a racket. Academia is kind of a racket, and a series I did a while back called "From Darwin to Donald Trump" is largely. I mean, it was my first sort of stab at a podcasting, and I'm not. You know, there's some things left to be desired by it. I always wish I could constantly go back and revise everything I do, but then I would never do anything. I would never go forward, right? So sometimes you just gotta let a thing lie, and we'll come back to it. Academics kind of a racket, okay? And a lot of our cultural experts, academics, elites, most of them exist in order to come on that news panel and be the expert and tell you what current knowledge is about a certain subject, okay? And then the science writers, like I talked about in the Science Writer and the Samurai, do the sort of the same thing. Like they get in the newspaper or the blog or the online periodical or whatever, right? Or they're a guest on, I don't know, some show. I don't even watch shows anymore. They're a guest on, what's that show with Chris Hayes? I'm going to do a deep dive on Chris Hayes at some point. Not on Chris Hayes, on the kind of nonsense he spouts. And then they're the expert, and the science writer relates to you what's going on in academia and all the cool new things that we've learned and how you should revise your traditional conservative beliefs because of all these new scientific things that we know. It's all a racket, okay? It's all a racket. You are in the midst of an attempted and very successful so far long-term and short-term project. They're the same project, but they have short-term components and long-term components. Okay, so it depends on what level of how far we zoom in. What sorts of activities do we want to attribute to this project? Depends on how far we zoom in. The project is reshaping society, like the president before Trump said, whatever that guy's name was. We're out to fundamentally change the society. Change a thing's fundamentals. You're changing its essence. You're changing its nature. Okay? But this is going to be a meaningless warning to you, and it is a warning to you, if you don't know what the nature of the thing is in the first place. And most people don't think a lot about the nature of themselves, their selves, I guess I should say. They don't think about the nature of society. They don't think about the nature. They don't think a lot about natures. It's a very philosophical, very kind of abstract, kind of weird thing to think about. These academics, the racket of academia, the game that's being played in academia, the program in academia is to move our culture towards socialism. It's sort of like socialism through the back door. Like you can't force socialism on free Americans who have guns and know better, right? But if you can get their kids, right? And if you can get their kids away from them out of the house, and you can corrupt them, with all manner of corruption, and then you can lure them off to a school where they're wowed and sort of entranced by high sounding intellectual talk and professors that they look up to who all tell them that everything their parents taught them was bullshit and this is what we know now, right? And if you can change their conception of themselves, if you can change the individual's conception of himself, and yes, I said himself, okay? You can change the individual's conception of himself, then you can change the society's conception of itself, and you can change the society, Okay. So I want to just reiterate the point from the beginning of last episode. And that point was, once again, when a person says that all is one, we can't really understand what they mean until we know what they mean, what they think existence can mean. In other words, if we were to draw a big circle on a piece of paper and say everything inside the circle is the things that exist, and everything outside the circle doesn't exist, right? What's in their circle, right? That's the question that I addressed at the beginning of last episode, and it was a question that this video that I was listening to as I ran this morning was addressing. And like I said last episode, I'm not eloquent, so let me just having said it a million times, let me just now have somebody more eloquent than myself say it for you, so you can just have the message reinforced and understand that I'm not talking out of my ass. Sophisticated string music. I cannot get this window to move up. Oh my gosh, sorry about all the intro here. Closer to the truth. Okay, I'm going to stop this throughout for two reasons. One practical and one theoretical. Okay, practically, if I keep interrupting this, then the algorithms at YouTube won't notice that I'm borrowing little clips from somebody else's video to explain and expound upon them to you, which should be fair use, but you know, YouTube being the corrupt organization that it is, I don't even want to broach, right? So I'm going to just keep pausing this and that'll interrupt the algorithms that inspect the audio files for duplication and so on and so forth. Okay, the second reason, the practical reason, no, that was the practical reason. The theoretical reason is because you can't just let a lot of this stuff go by without commenting on it because there's so much misinformation, okay? I just want to draw your attention to the title of this video, and it's a series, and God bless this guy. I mean, somebody, you know, it's, what is this, episode 49, 50 of my show. It's taken me like 2.5 years to get 50 episodes out. It's hard to do something well and keep doing it and do it to the extent that you originally envisioned doing. I mean, it's like, I can't knock this. This guy's got like 1,500 installments of whatever he's doing here. Fine. Okay. But look, I have to constantly disabuse you of common ideas about all this stuff that the people who teach this stuff and purvey it to the culture want you to think that are actually not true. We're going to do a lot of that in this episode. Okay. But there's one very general one. Okay. And it's encapsulated just by the opening of this video. Look, Scripture is very clear that our objection to the authority of God is not at its heart. Sorry, I'm looking out the window on the side of my house right now, and sometimes I feel like my neighbor thinks I'm looking straight into their house because it's like my line of vision is, it's like, where else am I going to look? Sometimes I just look into the air and talk. It's kind of an awkward moment when you lock eyes with a person in the next house. The Bible, Scripture is very clear. And it's striking. I mean, there's a lot of things. I think there's things that it's unclear on that I don't understand. There's a lot of things that it's very clear on. There's a lot of things that's very clear on that people make very unclear, and that's going to touch our point here. The Bible's very clear that our objection to the authority of God, and notice I just talked about the authority of God, not the reality of God, not the existence of God. Like this, there's a reason for that. Our objection to it is ethical in nature. It's that we don't like the idea of this authority. Okay, and it's not that we wonder whether God exists. You might say, yeah, there's a lot of people who wonder whether God exists. Well, okay, I know that's what they say, and a lot of times we tell ourselves things till we believe them ourselves, and the Bible has quite a bit to say about that too, about deceiving oneself. Okay, our objection, the Scriptures say, to God is because we don't want to obey. Okay. And so because of that, we fashion for ourselves all sorts of other objections in order to circumvent the responsibility to obey. Okay. And that attempt to skirt reality, that attempt to, well, in the book of Romans, it calls it suppress reality, suppress the knowledge of God, right? That takes it takes as many different forms as there are forms of human endeavor, period. Okay. But in academia, especially in philosophy, it takes a very definite and insidious and pervasive and endemic and just form, okay? And when I spell it out, you're going to think it's like the most innocent, innocuous thing in the world. But that's by design. Okay? We have a man he's in the dark, but there's a little window with light shining through it, and he's facing the light. He's moving from darkness to light, which seems to imply that he wants light and not darkness. He wants wisdom and not ignorance. He wants to know truth and not falsehood, etc., etc., etc. The position that the academic in our culture begins from, the position that the academic in our culture teaches you or your child when they go to college, the position that everyone is just supposed to believe is the fundamental truth of all inquiry is that man begins with an open mind. Begins just wondering what this big kooky place called the universe is, and looks for answers, and via science and maybe some other ways has found some pretty reliable ways to get answers. But as far as the more difficult questions that we can't come to, like we don't quite have the method down, or we don't know what the method would be to quite get at the answer, well, those are just like the dark spots in our ever-expanding field of knowledge, and we're trying to get there, but we're all striving for it, right? We're innocent. See the sense of innocence? There's like this, well, I don't know, this is a big scary place, I'm just trying to find the truth about it, right? I got to tell you and I got to be careful how I say it, because when you read scripture, that's not the story you're told. It's amazing that people have been able to build that story to sort of build that general story out of, there's a lot of theists, a lot of Christians who buy that story and like operate on that assumption that we're all just out here unsure of things, but wanting to know the truth about God if someone would just tell us, right? Or if someone would just show us, I guess we're going to be academic, the proper epistemological method. You got to be, I'm just drawing your attention to this. You can believe me, you can think that's right or not. Like you could be like, scripture, what the hell are you talking about? That's fine. I'm just telling you that when you go to that book, don't dismiss it yet, all right? When you go to that book, you're not given a picture of man like you're given in this picture. Facing the light, maybe in some darkness, but seeking the light. That's not the picture you're given of man. You're given the picture of man that he is running hither and thither, to and fro on this planet in all of his activities, in all of his endeavors, seeking to push down, like at Chuck E. Cheese's or Showbiz Pizza with the whack-a-mole game, seeking to push down the notion or the reality or the evidence or the suggestion or the allusion to anything that has to do with God or reflects God in any way, seeking to get it out of view anywhere possible, okay? Because he's at war with God. Because he doesn't want the authority in his world. He wants to be the authority in his world, not have an authority in his world. He doesn't want to take his life on authority and be responsible to God. I don't want to be responsible to God. I am a rebel. Okay, that's if you read scripture, that's what you learn about yourself. And it's one of these strange things. We talk about epistemology and we talk about how we come to know things and like what's the proper epistemology for religious knowledge and stuff. And it's a very interesting question. And a lot of people have a big problem with the idea of going to a book. They're like, that's just like an appeal to authority. You can't just like go to a book. Right? Yeah, they have this idea that it's as simple as going to a book and it says this, therefore we believe it. It is something like that. I'm not going to try to make it highfalutin. It's something that's revealed and confirmed in experience, I think. Maybe that's the best way to say it. Whatever. If you've met God and repented, you have some idea of what I'm talking about. Okay? If you don't, you need to. Or I should say, if you haven't, you need to. I'm just stopping us here because I want you to notice just what's implied by this picture. Okay? And now look, what this does, I keep saying it in these shows, everything is done to a purpose. Okay? Now, it's not, look at this picture. It's not just that you're being given this notion, it's being suggested to you that man is this kind of creature that is fundamentally oriented towards the truth. He's just groping, he's sort of clumsily and awkwardly groping his way towards it. You know? It's not just that. Think about what this conception, this picture, this suggestion, think about it, what it does to us as people in a society. This is what turns the experts into experts. Or you could say, this is what makes the experts authorities. This is what gives them the sort of cultural pull that they have. Because it's like, well, we're all just trying to figure out we're all just trying to figure out our way towards the truth. And some of us have really deep dived into this. They got postdocs and PhDs and all these letters after their name. And we need to, if we want to know anything, we got to go to them. And I'm not going to hold my opinion up against this person's because they've studied and they know. See, it's all treated as a matter of intellect. So, there's that passage in the New Testament where Jesus is talking about the nature. He extols, he recommends, he exhorts you towards a childlike mentality. And taken one way, that could seem really odd, right? Aren't we? Right? Because then Paul turns around and several books later, and he's like, when I was a child, I behaved like a child, but now I'm a man. Right? He's like, what's the deal here? Well, in a sense, right? Christ is saying, be like children in the sense that you trust your Father. Right? In a sense that you see the world through the sort of interpretive framework that your Father gives you. In the sense that you're obedient to your Father and right? Be like a child, believe. Don't set yourself up as the arbiter of all truth. Have some humility, right? So on this picture of things, and I mean literally this picture that we're looking at, okay, you can immediately see how the expert, the PhD, the whatever, becomes the authority, because it's there's all these questions about the deep things of life, and it's well, who are we going to defer to on these? Well, I guess somebody that's read all the books on them and knows all the theories on them. This whole picture assumes that the whole thing, as far as the deep things of life go, the meaning of life, the reality of God, the purpose, and all these things, that these are matters of intellect. And I'm telling you, if you read Scripture, you will find out that that's not the case, and that a child can know them better, in some cases, than the PhD. Okay? This is not a recommendation towards ignorance at all. In fact, I'm trying to fight ignorance here. It's not a recommendation towards naivety or ignorance or anti-intellectualism. It's a warning against false intellectualism. Okay? Okay, I got to get on here. I just want you to understand even what's contained in this picture. But the reason I brought up this program is just to sort of reaffirm what we talked about at the beginning of the last episode about there being a whole lot of things that it seems that we need to count as existing. But then, how do we account for them as existing? Because they don't seem like the sorts of things that we can touch or feel or hear or see or smell.
Mathematics describes the real world of atoms and acorns, stars.
Look, even, right? I'm not going to do this every 3 seconds, I promise. But what do we mean by the real world? Intuitively, a lot of us just tend to think, oh, I look out and I see all the material stuff. Okay? So even here, it's well, wait, what do you mean by the real world? I mean, he's just going to stage the question. He's going to pose the problem that we posed in yesterday's episode. He's going to say, but how could it be that this this realm, I'll use the word realm instead of world so we can stay clear here, this realm of abstract objects and formulae and laws and relations and, right, numbers and quantities and, right, how could it be that this abstract realm can tell us anything about the world of sense around us? Because, I mean, how could it have any existence of its own to begin with? Like, where is it? And some people they intuitively want to say, well, it's in our heads. But then you got to say, well, wait, what do you mean in our heads? Like, is it in our heads like they're just rules we came up with? Like, we drive on this side of the road here, but they drive on that side of the road there. It doesn't really seem like that because you can't change stuff about math. It's got this abiding, unchanging quality to it that leads you to suspect that you have, when you learn it, it leads you to feel as if you're discovering something rather than inventing something. Okay? And the past 100 years of philosophy have been this whole ongoing, multifaceted debate about the mind dependence or mind independence of these weird abstract objects beyond the physical world. Things like logical laws and numbers and laws of science and things like that. Are they dependent on our minds? Could we change them tomorrow or not? And again, the backdrop to all of this is just because we want to know what things go in that circle that we're calling existing things. Is it just the straightforwardly physical stuff? What about the number 4? Does the number 4 exist? What about the law of gravity? Does the law of gravity exist? Or any other weird like constants and laws that the mathematicians talk about? Do those exist? If we say no, then what the hell is science discovering? Right? If we say yes, where are they?
Bars and stairs. Simple abstract equations define complex physical things beautifully, elegantly. Why should this be?
And this is a poignant and pertinent one. And as we fade into the picture of the man standing before the giant, the bookshelf taller than him, full of volumes written by others, by the experts, others, and is seeking knowledge. The whole premise of this show is like the intellectual pursuit of God, or of the intellectual pursuit of God in the sense of is he there or is it there? What's real, right? This again, to go back to this refrain, the idea is that man starts off wondering honestly and innocently about God, and if you just show enough evidence, well then he'll follow it where it leads, right? That's the whole premise of this show. I disagree with that. Scripture disagrees with that. I'm just showing you this here so you can hear another sort of reformulation of the problem, and the problems that surround these abstract objects, these things that aren't straightforwardly, or I should just say, aren't material. If you say to me, I only believe, I'm going to make it a little bit more, I'm going to put a finer point on it because I know, I think I can mention some entities here that will hit your nerve a little bit harder because you might think, well, numbers, that's all. But look, there's going to be some entities that you think of as scientific entities that are not sensed with the senses. They're theoretical entities. Quarks are theoretical entities. Electrons are theoretical entities. And again, stop me if you've heard this one. No, don't, because I say it every 10 minutes. The past 100 years in philosophy, to put a nice round number on it, has just been this giant debate about, well, then how could we know about any of those things? Like, how do our minds have contact with any of those things? And most of the philosophers who have thought a lot about this, slightly more than half of them, like I said yesterday, have turned around and said, yeah, you know what? We couldn't. These are just made up things. And then the other was like, made up? How could they be made up? They perfectly describe the world that we say does exist.
The more I think about this, the more astonished I get. Albert Einstein said, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible.
Now look at this big library that he's sitting in, all these intimidating equations that he's perusing, right? Or meant to be, the suggestion is, right? Now, let me just ask you, if this is the way to God, who could be saved? Well, only the elites. Only the PhDs. They would effectually become not just professors, but priests, right? Because if you got to go to them to learn about whether God is and what God is and who God is and what God wants, if anything, if you got to go to these folks, then they are not just professors but priests. Anyway.
Physicist Eugene Wigner noted the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in science.
Why is it unreasonable? Why is the effectiveness of mathematics in science unreasonable? Because they begin by supposing that man is here in this world and on this planet by accident, that there's no intention behind him. Now you might think, what's this have to do with intention and intelligent design, all this stuff? Nothing. Listen, it's a deeper point. If there is a thing behind the world, if man's mind is in some way made to understand the world, like you could say, maybe we could use a metaphor like being hardwired or something. Like if man's mind is wired to the universe because they were commonly created to reciprocate, right? The universe was meant to be comprehensible and man's mind was meant to comprehend it. Then the whole thing makes sense. But these folks begin by supposing that man is just this accidental blip. He's just this circumstantial, accidental, random event. He just came on the scene and he finds himself here and he opens his eyes and he looks around the big, dark, cold, scary universe and he goes, what is it all? And he doesn't know how to figure that question out until he discovers, on down through the centuries, the scientific method. And then he starts to get a handle on it. But then, a few centuries later, a bunch of smarty pants go, well, hold on a second. This scientific method uses, and this is the question we're at now, all these things that are abstract and non-scientific in nature. Laws of logic are not things that you can empirically discover. We talked about what the word empirical means yesterday. Numbers are not things that you can empirically discover. These formulae are not, these laws as expressed in equations, they're not things that you can see, touch, hear, taste, or smell. See, touch, hear, taste, smell. Is that all five? Yeah. All right. So, how is it that this intangible world so reliably tells us about the tangible world? And you know what they say to this question? They say, we have no reason to suppose that it does. Therefore, we have to suppose that either we have no real knowledge of the world, science isn't telling us real things about the world. And I just want to tell you something as an aside. This is the point where the sort of like academic materialist and the Marxist postmodern critical theory materialist, this is the point that they're eventually going to vertex on. This is the point where they're eventually going to meet. Eventually, all these like, all this like uncertainty and stuff with quantum mechanics is going to be used, is going to be harnessed once the sort of like Black Lives Matter folks get a hold of like, well, they're already starting to get a hold of Darwin, right? Saying like Darwin's racist white patriarchy, right? All that stuff that comes down from Marx. This is going to be the point where they meet. All right. All this uncertainty and this sort of like randomness behind the universe is going to be used to bolster this idea that we really create the world with our minds, and therefore everything's a construction of ours. Race is a construction. Gender is a construction. Sex is, all these things are constructions of our mind because we're creating the world as we live it. Right. This is going to be the point where these two strands of atheism or these two strands of materialism meet. It's already starting to happen. That's just my view. It's for a different show. But anyways, here he is on the nice leather couch in the beautiful library seeking the truth. And I'm sorry, but that's just not what happens. You know what? It's just not. We don't want the truth. Because the truth means that we're in trouble. All right? Because we're lawbreakers. And we know it. Because we can't get away from this idea that there's a way that we're supposed to behave and don't. No one can get away from it. Even the folks who want to say there's no real way you're supposed to behave, then chastise everyone for behaving a certain way. You can't get away from it. You can't get away from sin. I mean, you can, but not the way these folks want to. And there's only one way to get away from it.
So is mathematics invented by humans, like chisels and hammers and pieces of music? Or is mathematics discovered, always out there, somewhere, like mysterious islands waiting to be found?
Okay, again, he doesn't mean in the material world. They're showing planets and space and stuff. They're just saying out there. Is mathematics dependent on our decision? Did we come up with it? Or are we discovering it? Okay? Again, If we're discovering it, then it seems to have some independent existence apart from us. But how could something that seems mental and abstract in nature, something that you can't see anywhere in the material world, how could it have existence apart from us? Now, there's a real clear answer to this, and they actually jokingly say it in this episode, right? But no one can see the implications of it, or nobody wants to follow the implications of it backwards to a proper understanding of how to... Historically, theologically, in the history of the church thinkers, this problem has been closely related to the idea of creation has been used, employed, deployed to alleviate this problem. Here's what I mean. All these people are so baffled because they look out into the world and they just see material. They just see concrete stuff, particles, things you can measure and weigh and poke and burn, right? And then they go, but then where are the numbers? Where are the numbers? Where are they? Where's that realm? Right? And the Christian just goes, well, the Scripture does say that we actually we have our being. There's that word again. We have our existence in God. And God, at least relative to us, I won't say God is an abstract entity, but at least relative to the concreteness that we take to be the real thing, right? God's abstract in that sense. They're just ideas in the mind of God. I mean, in a sense, we're ideas in the mind of God on that view, right? So for the person who believes in God already, like before they go into this investigation, and there's been a lot of thinkers like this, Augustine was one, Malebranche was another. A lot of the rationalists in the history of philosophy who are Christians have some sort of idea about this, but they never seem to be able to sort of like wrap it up and draw it its full conclusion and let that conclusion like inform the rest of their epistemology. But it's there. They're just ideas in the mind of God, right? Let me let this play out a little bit before I lay something like that on you. Okay, but anyways, but for the person who doesn't think, for the person who thinks that there was never a mind until evolution produced a mind, like they don't think there's a mind behind the world. They just think the world's a bunch of concrete stuff that resulted in a bunch of little error-prone minds. So for those people, they're like, how could that mind, like where are these abstract entities that don't seem to change from one mind to another? What's holding it all together? They just can't wrap their head around it. No pun intended.
The question probes the deepest secrets of existence.
Not really.
Is mathematics invented or discovered?
Discovered. Here's another refrain of mine. And I say this as a person who's been thoroughly seduced and is recovering, okay? I don't say this to point fingers. I mean, I am pointing fingers, but I say this as a guilty party myself, okay? And this is kind of the impetus for the show in general. I mean, the seduction of intellectualism is just unbearable, right? We are all self-idolaters, and it seems to me like aspects of our higher nature, like our intellectual faculties, are just prime territory. They're just prime territory for idolizing ourselves. I mean, look at this image of this like guy sitting out there. We got all these numbers passing through the screen. He's just thinking so hard. Jesus said, "Be like children. Be like children." Okay. And he implied that childlike trust, that faith in the authority of God's word and his authority, which you can't really see until you've come to grips with your own. You can't really see that. It's like blocked from your vision until you repent. In other words, you don't get to take shortcuts to God. This is what the academics don't understand. Like, you don't get to first go, well, I'm going to figure him out intellectually so that I can decide whether and to what extent I will repent. Right? This is how they want to treat it. Like, it's first an intellectual thing, and then once we've investigated thoroughly, we come to some sort of reasonable, maybe not for sure or certain, but reasonable or probabilistic conclusion about who and what, if anything, God is. Then we'll get on to the business of what we need to do for God, or how we need to interact with God. But first, let's just sit here on this dead tree branch in the desert and like imagine all these numbers going by. It's just idolatry. It's just idolizing the human mind. It's just, you know. Oh, man. I say this as a guilty party. I don't get down with this anymore. I sort of see through it now. But, man, the seduction of intellectualism, you know. And again, I said, this is so... I mean, one of the upshots of all this is that you then view the folks with the letters after their names as the authorities, and they become your priests, okay? They become the authority to you on matters of all things.
I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and closer to truth is my journey to find out.
See, I mean, this is the premise of the whole show. Is mathematics invented or discovered? So they're going to run through some arguments on both sides, but I just want you to understand this is a thing, okay? Maybe is that clear? I was going to play more of this. I'm not. We could maybe do a deep dive on it later. I know I'm just writing checks with my mouth that I can't cash. But I want to get on here because we're already at 40 minutes, and I want to get on. Dang it, sorry. I want to get on. I'm having a hard time navigating. I have a very small laptop display. It's hard to keep everything in view. I want to get on to the purpose of this episode, which was to actually now go through this article that I began by introducing. I'm out of coffee here. Last episode, this being part 2 of that episode. All is one, part 2. All right. I want to read this article with you so you can see the trickery and the confusion at work. So we're just going to sort of methodically, slowly go through it. I'm going to break away here and there to make some offhanded remarks. But at the beginning, I'm going to break away to quite a large extent because I want to do some history for you. I want you to understand the origin of this notion that is so casually being tossed around and expressed and supposedly investigated in this article, this notion that all is one, or this idea that all is one. I want to give you like the intellectual history on that. Okay? So this article, and I'm going to do it right after like reading the first paragraph of the article. So we're going to start and then stop, which is as is my wont. Okay? This article, we said yesterday that it begins with this juxtaposition of these two quotes, one by a recent and lauded and esteemed scientist, and the other by a sort of like authority in like Eastern religion, or like a figurehead of Eastern religion. And I said that this is a frequent move. Okay? These days, this is a frequent move. Okay? Because as our society lurches away from its rudiments, from its foundation in Western notions, one of the ways that's affected is to get us to sort of like imbibe Eastern notions, right? So one of the ways of doing that is to get people to think that we've made these discoveries in science and old Eastern religious notions are vindicated by these discoveries, right? So the idea is like, well, here's so-and-so, the physicist, from this century, and he's saying basically the same thing that so-and-so was saying way back in this ancient text in India, in like 6th century BC, right? That's the idea, right? And thereby indirectly denigrate Western culture as it has sprung from Scripture, to put the point bluntly, from Scripture, okay? From the Bible. So I read the two quotes yesterday. I'm not going to read them again here because I can't just rehash the whole episode. So let's begin with the first sentence of the piece, okay? And then we're going to break away for a little historical excursion. And the reason I'm doing this, you might say, well, I know something. You've been lied to. You are constantly lied to, okay? And you're even lied to as like an undergrad in philosophy. If you just if you just have like a passing interest in this stuff, and you go into it and you take a few classes and you're going to be told a story about the history of ideas in a certain way. And it has the form that it does in order to reinforce these ideas that I've been talking to you about here, that man is just this innocent creature who's openly and honestly investigating the universe and has some truth but doesn't have it all and is really striving for all of it and would follow the evidence wherever it leads, right? It's this candle in the dark. Our knowledge is just this candle in the dark, and we're trying to find our way. Okay? So here's the article. It begins like this. The belief that everything in the universe is part of the same fundamental whole exists throughout many cultures and philosophical, religious, spiritual, and scientific traditions, as captured by the phrase, all that is. Okay? And then comes the obligatory mention of some quantum mechanics personage, right? Because that now the big sexy thing is to always appeal to quantum mechanics or appeal to the authority of a someone in that field, right? Because it's all ambiguous and confusing, and that's the way they like things. Anyways, the idea here is we're now going to reference a quantum mechanics guy, and look, even a quantum mechanics guy thinks that this is a plausible notion that all is one. Why would that be weird for a quantum mechanics guy? Because the quantum mechanics is supposed to be all filled with these like inherent contradictions, and it's very hard to say anything definite in quantum mechanics. It all sort of depends on like the framework or like the model that on which you're modeling the behavior of the entity in question. And there's different ways of doing it. So it seems very relativistic, right? So to say something like all is one, given quantum mechanics, you might think was sort of like, there'd be something weird about that. And here the author's like, no, even the quantum mechanics folks are on board with this notion that the universe has a basic oneness. He says, Erwin Schrödinger once observed that quantum physics is compatible with the notion that there is indeed a basic oneness to the universe. So that was like a little name drop. That's all that is a name drop. In fact, quantum it's compatible with the basic oneness of the universe because it's compatible with anything. One of my philosophy professors used to say, everything follows from a contradiction, right? It's compatible with everything because we don't know what the hell's going on, right? And it could be anything. But let's go back to this first sentence. The belief that everything in the universe is part of the same fundamental whole. The belief that everything in the universe is part of the same fundamental whole exists throughout many cultures and philosophical, religious, spiritual, and scientific traditions, as captured by the phrase, all that is. Now, this is the only remark along these lines that the author of the piece makes, but I want to fixate on it for a second and give you a little bit of history of it. Okay? I'm not on my own lecture notes. I'm not on my own notes here. I lost a lot of personal effects in 2020. So this is going to be a little bit brief, maybe a little bit shaky, but I'm going to try to just give you, I got to be brief about this, but this is so important because if you go, and From Darwin to Donald Trump, that series I did a while back, I said, if you enroll in a liberal arts college these days, there are certain things that you're going to be like told a story and expected to believe a very definite story about. And like one of them is like the relationship between like Rene Descartes and Charles Darwin and what we know now about the human mind. That's one thing where there's like a very definite sort of like orthodoxy in the university. And it just takes the form of like this narrative about how we came to know things and when we came to know them and what we know now based on, right? And it's not true, but it's useful, right? And you're expected to regurgitate it. So here's another one. Okay? I say that just to say here's another one. And it's kind of what I was getting at with my comments on the opening picture of this video, that we are all just innocent observers, innocent investigators looking for the truth and would follow it if we found it. Okay? If you take an ancient philosophy class, you'll probably start with Plato and Aristotle, or said another way, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Right? Socrates was the teacher of Plato. He didn't write anything himself. We know about Socrates because of what Plato wrote about him. And apparently, presumably, presumptively, allegedly, what Plato wrote about him were just his words in dialogue with other people. Dialogues that eventually got him executed because people got so frustrated with him picking apart their theories. Okay? But there's this whole sort of like beginning to philosophy, sort of, before Socrates. Okay, that you'll probably like, your professor might say something about it on like day one of ancient philosophy class, or maybe like you might spend one class on it or two classes on it, so they can just sort of give you the backdrop for when Socrates comes on the scene. But there's 6, 7, 8, 9, I don't know, philosophers, loosely speaking, that come before Socrates, and we call them the pre-Socratics, in the centuries leading up to that sort of like golden age with Plato and Aristotle, right? And they're very important, okay? For at least two reasons. Here's the two reasons that immediately come to mind for me. These are very important. One is what I just said, because you're told this story about who they were and why they're important, and that story is itself false, and you need to understand why you're told it and what's false about it. Okay? And the other one is related to that. It's like once you can disabuse yourself of that and see what they were doing for what it was, then you can better understand the current debates and what folks are doing now. You can sort of see the continuity with the struggle, the question, types of answers that were given and the assumptions that were made as far back as the 6th century BC and the way things are handled now. Now I'm going to get excited. I'm not joking. Like, I know, again, I'm going to have to pull this. Let me just prove to you that I'm not talking out of my ass thing again in a minute here, because late last night, I was listening to something on YouTube. I found a conference with a bunch of theorists of science and scientists. Oh gosh, I gotta wait. There's one of the pre-Socratics that we're going to mention here where, like, look, there's nothing new under the sun. Okay? And what the theory that was being sort of like elucidated in this conference and sort of kicked back and forth and developed and argued about and suggested was like identical to what one of these pre-Socratics says. So it's important to recognize that identity, and it's important to recognize why the pre-Socratic guy said it in the first place. And I'm telling you, to go back to the prior point, why they said it is not why you're told that they said it. Okay? What you're told when you go to college is that man is this innocent, honest investigator. So what right? And so in all his endeavors in mathematics and science and philosophy, he's just searching for the truth. He's in the dark, but he's looking for the light. And like in that picture that we saw, he's headed towards the window. He wants the light. All right? If truth would just reveal itself to him, or if he could find it, he would certainly appreciate it and hold on to it and pursue it, right? Because he wants it. That's what you're told. That's not true, but that's what you're told. So these pre-Socratic guys are very important, because once you understand that that's not true, you can see what they're doing. And once you see what they're doing, you can see it being done again and again and again and again throughout the history of ideas. All the way on down to this conference that I was just watching, where these guys are pushing this theory that is essentially identical to what Heraclitus said. Heraclitus was a philosopher in 500 something BC, prior to Socrates. Okay? So I just need to just a little bit tell you about these guys that you're told very little about in school. So that's what we're going to do here. And it's really important, because these were like the originators of the all is one idea. And you'll see how in a moment, okay? All right. So, I mean, I don't know what I want to call this a deep dive. Maybe you call it a somewhat semi-deep dive. I'm not going to go too far into this, but I got to go far enough into it for you to see the point. I just said you might not be told anything about the pre-Socratics if you, as an undergrad philosophy major, or you might get like a day or two of discussion of them in your first week of ancient philosophy, but then you get on to Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, right? But if you are told about the pre-Socratics, whether in class or in like the standard philosophical or history of philosophy textbook, here is the salient point. Here is what you will be told. Here's the story that you'll be told. Here's the lesson or the takeaway that you'll be told is important to understand about the pre-Socratics. And it is related to our comments on the picture that video began with, of the man in the dark looking towards the light and moving towards it. All right, it's related to the commentary on that picture. What you'll be told is that why the pre-Socratics are important is because what they show or represent historically or illustrate is man, for the first time, demonstrating a sort of like scientific approach to the world and to knowledge. Okay? Here's another way to say it. What they show or represent is man, for the first time, seeking for explanations of himself and the world around him that did not appeal to religious notions like God or the gods. So the idea usually gets fleshed out like this. Before the pre-Socratics, all the accounts of man and his place in the world really were addressed by way of like stories, and those stories were based in myths, and those myths were fundamentally religious in nature. They were about the gods or God, right? So what the pre-Socratics are, and thus why they're important, you'll be told, is because for the first time they are pushing to the side these mythical religious notions, these appeals to otherworldly factors or origins or causes, and trying to answer the fundamental questions of being, the fundamental questions of existence, and, as we'll see in a moment, relatedly, the fundamental questions of knowledge. They are trying to answer those questions by only appealing to the world itself. And this, you'll be told, so the story goes, is like the first blossoming of what will eventually become the scientific mind. Okay? And you'll be introduced to a number of these pre-Socratic characters. Like I said, there's a handful of them. And what they all have in common is what we just said you'll be told about them. But then within the group, there's this interesting sort of cleavage, this dichotomy, this dividing line, where there's sort of one sort of school of thought about those questions, and then this other school of thought that disagrees with them about those questions. So there's a commonality and a difference. Okay? Now, we're going to track that commonality and difference as we sort of run through who these guys were and what they said. I'm going to do this pretty fast, okay? The first group that the first group that sort of appears on the scene historically are what we call the monists. Monists, like mono, like that disease you get in high school where it makes you sleepy. Monists. Why are they called monists? Because they believe that, are you ready for this? All is one. In other words, all of the things in this world, in existence, in being, in our experience, all of these things that seem like different things, that multiplicity, which is presupposed by particularity, in other words, there are different distinct things, right? That multiplicity is superficial. And that really, the real story of reality, the really real, is unity, is oneness. So there's a sort of like level of reality and level of appearance, or level of truth and level of sort of like facade, or right? The false story, the superficial story, is the world's full of different and distinct and myriad things. Okay? And the true story is that all is one. Now, the several of them gave several different answers as to what that oneness consisted in, but here the important point is that they all said in their various ways that the particularity, the multiplicity, the plurality that we experience is not really real. Now, as with everything in philosophy, it sounds crazy until you understand the motive. And once you understand the motive or the reason, then it starts to sound less crazy, because you realize there's like natural things that lead you to say things like this. Well, the fundamental inclination towards any sort of statement about all being one is just kind of like related to what they said about Einstein's observation in that video we just saw. The universe is understandable, or it seems to be. We seem to have knowledge of some things, right? But if it's all a hodgepodge, random, chaotic, right? If there's no order to it, if there's no systematicity to it, if there's no unity to it, then it doesn't seem like it could be understandable, right? So there has to be some unity to the thing, even though there's particularity and multiplicity and difference on the surface, right? The law of gravity binds all bodies with mass. So everything from pins and needles to dandelions to Saturn, okay? All bodies that have mass are governed by this law. This law is the more fundamental unity that explains the behavior in this case. Right? See, the unity is the real story. It's a deeper thing. So these guys emphasize the unity. Then the question is, well, what is it? Okay, so the world's intelligible, so there's got to be this unity underneath it. So what is it? This first guy, Thales, was like, oh, I know what it is. It's water. And he said, all is water. Now, it sounds absurd, but you have to remember, if we just put ourselves in these shoes, or the alleged shoes of what these guys were about, what they were trying to do, and right? Well, we've already established that something's got to tie it all together. What could that thing be? You know, well, we see there's this stuff and it falls from the sky, and when things ingest it, they inflate and get bigger and grow and thrive, and when they lack it, they die, and you know what I mean? It's cyclical. Like I said, it falls from the sky, then evaporates and goes back up and falls again. It comes in all these different forms, and it seems to be so closely correlated with life and generation and growth, right? You can sort of see how if we're going to pick something that is the underlying thing to all things, water's a reasonable candidate. Just down the street from me, all down my street. I came back from this run. I always pass these signs, you know. In this house, we believe that love is love and science is real and blah, 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 blah. And one of them says, and water is life. There's nothing new under the sun. Now, the next guy on the scene is the student of the first guy we just mentioned. And the next guy's name is Anaximander. And he looked at what his teacher said, and he was like, yeah, but no. Yeah, there has to be some underlying thing that ties it all together, that gives it the unity that we attribute to it, and thus makes it intelligible to us. But that thing can't be one of the things that we find in the thing. Does that make sense? Why? This is very important. And actually, we're not going to go on to Plato here, but if we did, this would become way important. And so we're going to have to come back to this at some point. But here's why. This is very interesting. Now listen, in the series that we did called Unmasking Antifa, I talked probably a little bit, I hope, about how what Marx did philosophically was predicated on what a few other guys, some German guys, did prior to him philosophically, namely Immanuel Kant and Friedrich Wilhelm von whatever, von Hegel, right? And I said that Marx has had a huge effect on Marx's philosophical notions have had a huge effect on philosophy and theology, and now they're starting to have an effect on science, as we see in the news. Gosh, there's so much stuff I could read here. That you had there's this problem that gets created called, well, look, here, let me say this another way. I can go 3 houses down one way on my street and see the sign or several instances of the yard sign that I just mentioned to you. Or I can turn and go the other way down the street, take a right, and then a left 2 streets down, and I can pass a church that has a sign on its lawn. And the sign reads, "Don't put a period where God has put a comma." And then there's a big rainbow flag in front of the church and a sign on the church that says head pastor Mrs. or the Reverend Mrs. so-and-so, right? A woman, right? And you'll find that a lot of these post-Protestant or quasi-Protestant or used to be Protestant denominations that get on board with a lot of this philosophy, there are a lot of female pastors, and that many of them espouse a female God. Now, all of this is not coincidence, okay? why are you talking about this when you're talking about the pre-Socratics and all is water, Nick? Is because when Anaximander looks at Thales' theory that all is water, he says, well, hold on. Yes, I agree there's got to be an all-encompassing something underlying the whole thing. There's got to be a substrate. There's got to be a thing that makes everything what it is. But here's the thing about that thing. It can't itself be one of the things that we're trying to explain. Water is one of the things that we find in the multiplicity of experience. So it can't thereby explain, or to say that it does explain the multiplicity of experiences, to kind of go in a circle. It's one of the things we're trying to explain. So then he goes a step further and he says, and guess what? Anything in experience that we pointed to would pose the same problem. There's a jet going over right now, I apologize. You see, anything that we substituted there for Thales' water, we could make the same criticism about. So he says, yeah, there's a thing, there's this thing that underlies everything, but whatever it is, it can't have any of the properties that we find in when we investigate our sensory experience, because those are the things we're trying to find the explanation of. So it has to be, I'm coming to female pastors here in a second, and I'm coming to the assertion that God is female or genderless, and thus underpinning and sort of, man, there's so many relations here to the transgender movement and to the transgender movement's relation to Immanuel Kant. And just, listen, I can't do it all at once. Anaximander says it can't be anything like what we experience, because then it would just be one of the things that requires explanation, which is where we started in the first place. It has to be unlike any property that we can experience and thus have a concept of, so we can have no concept of it. It's like an unknown. He called it the indefinite. Right? It's like, thanks, man. Okay. What is it, Anaximander? It's the indefinite. Well, okay, but why is it the indefinite? Just think about this. Because to say anything positive about it, you'd have to invoke a concept that you had supposedly garnered through your experience in the physical world. But supposedly that experience is superficial. It's an experience of the myriad particular multiplicity. And that's the thing that we're trying to explain by this underlying unity. So the underlying unity can't itself be composed of one of the elements we find in the thing to be explained. Okay? So anything positive, here comes the theological point, anything positive about the church down the street, anything positive that we said about it would have to involve one of these concepts that we can't use here. So we can say nothing definite about it. It is the indefinite. So all is one, but it all comes from this thing that shall not be named because it cannot be named. Nothing positive can be said about it. And it's the same sort of argument that you get after Marx in the 20th century philosophy and theology, where now we have what's called negative theology. We cannot say what God is. We can only say what God's not. And this is where, in a loose related, I'm not going to go through all the steps here, but this is where you get the don't put, this affects interpretation and hermeneutics, and this is where you get the don't put a comma where God is put a period, and this is where you get the God is genderless or encompasses all genders, or don't gender God. Or, this is right. You get this. See, you can't say anything positive about God. Positive, I don't mean positive like uplifting or good. I mean positive in the sense that it asserts a quality, an attribute, a property that God has. Here's another related consequence. This is kind of a different way of saying the same thing, but it might help you see. It might also be a way to help you see what he was doing, and it'll also help you see what one of his critics that we're going to mention next was doing. It can't be something that we find in our experience because we experience opposites, right? It can't be water because then what's the explanation of dryness? How can a thing generate its opposite? that would seem to deny the very notion of what an opposite is, right? An opposite is the opposite of one thing. Is like if I have this thing over here, then the opposite of it has all the opposite qualities of that. In other words, it doesn't share any properties with that thing. It's the opposite of it, right? So I can't appeal to water to explain the origin and founding and grounding of all being and existence, because one of the things I find in the thing I was trying to explain in the first place is the opposite of wetness, dryness, right? So we get this opposites problem, which again is a reason that Anaximander's like, yeah, but no, Thales. It's the indefinite. And I was just at pains to point out a moment ago that same kind of argument that he leverages to prove that all is one and the one is an indefinite thing we can't say anything about are leveraged centuries later and relatedly to say that we can say nothing positive about God. We can say nothing definite about God, thus relativizing and subjectivizing and eventually eliminating all of religion from intellectual discussion. I'd like to say more about this because there's interesting ethical aspects to what these guys say too, but I'm just going to stick to the existence stuff. Okay, so actually it's going to come in when we talk about Heraclitus. After Anaximander, these guys got great names. If you're looking for a name, if you're expecting, after Anaximander is Anaximenes. And he, in the same way, is like, yeah, but no. So Anaximander bristles at Thales' notion that the thing that explains everything could be itself be one of the things. And so he goes to this extreme far end from that, and he says it's absolutely indefinite. It's this complete indeterminacy out of which, that's the only way we could get opposites, right? It can't. Incidentally, Anaximander, the guy we were talking about before, the green guy, his explanation of how we get this world out of that indefinite thing is essentially an evolutionary theory. He said, well, the whole thing is kind of spinning, right? And out of the spinning, like the inherent opposites in that undifferentiated mass sort of like attract each other. It's a sort of like selection process in a way, if you think about it, sort of attract each other. And that's how we get the particular material world, is like eventually this process sort of keeps spinning. Like you imagine like a centrifuge, or the picture that this article begins with, as I will bring up now. All right? See? He says this thing is sort of spinning, and out of it all this sort of like the hot attracts hot, and the cold attracts cold, and the dense attracts dense, and the non-dense attracts non-dense, and the wet attracts wet, and the dry attracts dry, and right? And out of it, and look, prior to Darwin, Hume had an evolutionary theory too, and all of these things are just like on a continuum with each other. They're all kind of saying the same thing. You might think that Darwin is way more empirical and sophisticated than this, but at its heart, it's not, because it begins metaphysically just like Darwin begins, and it has to go where it goes because of that. So anyways, Anaximenes looks at Anaximander's attempt to fix Thales, and I'm getting these names confused now. Anaximenes says, well, look, we can't say it's indefinite, all right, because that's like nothing, okay? It has to be something. Like, it's no good to say that there is this fundamental thing if there's absolutely nothing you can say about it. So let's bring it back down a notch, guys. Let's bring it back into the realm of our experience. What in our experience could maybe do the job of producing this world of multiplicity and thus opposites, right? We gotta sort of bring it back down to earth a little bit here, no pun intended. And so he's like, hey guys, look, purse your lips real tight and blow on your hand. Air's cool, isn't it? And then he's like, hey guys, open your mouth real wide and breathe on your hand. Air's hot, isn't it? And then they're like, yeah. And he's like, hey guys, see, maybe air's the thing. Because air seems to, as demonstrated by my little experiment there, have this ability, these properties of being more or less dense or more or less rare, and it seems to exhibit opposite qualities based on that state. So maybe my teacher was wrong. Maybe was it Anaximander? Yeah, I think this is a succession. Maybe Anaximander was wrong. Regardless, maybe Anaximander was wrong. Maybe it could be a thing in our experience if we could find a thing that sort of maybe could be the origin of opposites in the way that this guy was supposing nothing could, and therefore was forced to say something as absurd as the underlying thing is a thing of which we can say nothing, absolutely nothing about, right? Anaximenes was like, no, but that can't be. So here, maybe this is it, okay? After Anaximenes, now all these guys have in common is they're emphasizing that look, what's the name of the show? They're emphasizing that all is one. The unity, the oneness is the real story, and the particularity, what we experience in the world is the not real story. It's a superficial story. So after them, you get some other guys, Xenophanes, who's actually more focused on knowledge than he is being. But he essentially articulates what all these guys have been suggesting implicitly by the way they're practicing. He essentially says, he encapsulates the whole pre-Socratic mindset. He says, look, we don't look to the gods for this. The gods have never told us anything about life. God has never communicated with man. We're on our own. We got to figure these things out, and we got to figure out a method for figuring them out. Okay? There's another guy you might have heard of named Heraclitus. And if you haven't heard of Heraclitus, or if you're not sure if you've heard of Heraclitus, you might have heard of a quip that Heraclitus made, because the quip goes like this: no one ever steps in the same river twice. No one ever steps in the same river twice. Sometimes you hear that. You hear these little catchphrases of philosophy, the history of philosophy. Like you hear people say, if a tree fell in the forest and nobody's there to hear it, would it make a sound? Right? These little bits that come down to us because somebody said them. They were taken to be profound and suggestive and provocative, or like a larger problem. Heraclitus said, no one ever steps in the same river twice. And the idea being like reality as we experience it is in this constant state. I mean, this is the kind of thing philosophers talk about. It's like, look, if you're just this conglomeration of atoms, if that's all you are, right? Well, talk to me in 7 years, because all the cells in your body will have died and regenerated. And so if all you are is the sum total of all the cells in your body, well, then by definition, you're a different being than you were 7 years ago, right? Like if this is how we're counting what things are, see, this matters, right? Then you're a different thing. Well, then we got to revise the criminal justice system, and we got to revise, right? Heraclitus said, no one ever steps in the same river twice. Experience is just this, like if we fast forwarded, if we time lapsed the universe, it's just like things growing, things shrinking, things dying, things exploding, things coming into being, things going out of it. There's nothing constant, everything changes. Well, then where is there a place for truth? Kind of like in a similar way we asked towards the beginning of the episode, and we introduced the episode by both yesterday and today by saying, like, where is the place for logical laws and laws of mathematics and all these other abstract things that we think we need to understand this world that, as Heraclitus is telling us and as our experience confirms, that's my phone, is all in flux and all changing. Like, where's the room for those? Where's the room for those non-material things? And Heraclitus, you can think of him as a monist, like these other guys. He sort of sounds like not a monist here, right? Because he's saying, he's saying like the world is this river that you never step in this. You can never step in the same river twice, because when I step in here, the water is here. I take another step, right, and that water that I first stepped in is down there now because the river's moving, right? So I'm never stepping in the same river if river is just defined as the water in front of me, right? It's always different. So you could be like, it doesn't sound like a monist. But Heraclitus, the flip side of this coin for Heraclitus is that there has to be an underlying order to all that. Otherwise, we couldn't know anything about it. And we do seem to learn about it. So underneath this flux of like particular materiality, there has to be some sort of like grid. Look at the picture again. I'm telling you, this stuff is so important. There has to be some like order. There has to be some structure, this framework, this reason to things, right? But you can't learn it through the things themselves because they're all changing. So he's like, we got to just be like in touch with it somehow, right? And that's how we can have knowledge. So he's kind of a monist in the sense that he thinks that the real thing is like this framework, this structure, this scaffolding, this like conceptual scaffolding. He calls it the logos, this like order of all things that's behind the thing. And that's what our minds That's what you have to work with your mind to get in touch with. And that's how that's how you're able to comprehend this otherwise incomprehensible world of constantly fluctuating material, constantly generating and corrupting and dying and growing, right? That's why it's intelligible to you, is because what you're understanding is not really that stuff, but the order behind it. All right. No one ever steps in the same room. So, but now look, he's very materialistic, and look how a form of, look how naturally mysticism grows out of materialism. What do you mean mysticism grows out of materialism, Nick? It's like, look, Heraclitus, out of one side of his mouth, he's like, no one ever steps in the same river twice. But then he posits this like abstract ordering principle behind the world that somehow our minds are able to get in touch with if we practice and if we can find it, right? But there's not like a clear method. It's like, it's not real clear how you do that or how you know when you've got it. It's sort of mystical, all right? And it's not, we haven't outgrown this, because I could flip this other tab of YouTube open here and play this thing that from my history that I was listening to yesterday, this conference where these guys, it's called The Hidden Nature of Nature, which is essentially Heraclitus's whole thing. Nature as we experience it in the physical sense cannot explain our ability to understand nature. So there has to be this ordering principle behind nature that encapsulates it all and explains it all and causes it all and makes it all intelligible to us. And some of us are in better touch with that thing. Here comes the mysticism element or the priestly element, or at least the deference to the experts in our culture, in our modern day element to it. Some of us are more in touch with it than others, and the philosophical endeavor is the endeavor to get in touch with it, and it explains nature itself, right? This conference was called The Hidden Nature of Nature, and it's like, look, we have this issue where we can't explain biological information. Like we have, we're Darwinists and stuff, but we have this problem with information theory. We can't explain how, right, the information that's necessary, information, right? That's an abstract thing, right? Now we're getting towards Heraclitus. We can't explain the information, how the various cell processes are able to make the decisions that they make, right? We can't explain this. So they're like, here's seriously, this is what the conference is about. They're like, maybe quantum mechanics explains it, right? And then they just start pontificating and speculating wildly and just padding the area with jokes, quantum mechanics jokes, to hide the fact that they're not saying anything substantial. They're just like totally speculating on, well, maybe the answer's in randomness, or maybe, right? And it's called The Hidden Nature of Nature. This is just like 2 years ago. Heraclitus is 600 something BC. It's the same thing. Anyways, the other interesting thing about Heraclitus is that whereas Anaxagoras had explained the sort of coming to be of all things as this sort of evolutionary like spinning. I mean, think about when you see pictures of space and you see like those things that are galaxies. You're like, well, we're looking at like hundreds, thousands of galaxies here. You see those galaxies, right? And towards the center, they're solid, but they're in like the spiral motion, right? And towards the outside, they get sparse and differentiated. Like you start to get particularity. Kind of picture, I'm just saying in a metaphorical way, kind of picture Anaxagoras' evolutionary theory like that. Like the indefinite is the center, the solid, the undifferentiated, non-particular unity, right? And then it's spinning and the opposites attract each other. Never mind how there could be opposites or how they could find each other in this, right? What that even means, right? Never mind all that. We're doing philosophy here. And then you get the particularity of experience out of that. Well, Heraclitus has a different story about how we get the world we get out of the ordering, this ordering principle, this hidden nature of nature behind it. And he has this theory that involves opposites and their war with one another. So everything's, in other words, for Heraclitus, everything is in tension. The world as we experience it, the differentiating, the thing that makes things different from each other, and sort of like the threshing machine through which everything passes to become what it is like this tension that is created by opposites fighting with one another. So just like in Darwin, survival and thus death is at the center of the explanation of differentiation. Same with Heraclitus. The war between opposites, whatever they be, hot and cold or the fox and the hound, right? Like the war between opposites is fundamental to the thing coming to be the way it is. So he puts conflict, like Marx, at the center metaphysically of all things. Now, how could you get an ethical theory out of that? Likewise, how could you get an ethical theory out of Darwin? If everything advances through conflict and death and survival, and right, if that's how things progress, why would you F with that? See, you can't get it. You can't get an ethics out of Darwin. They try to appeal to things like altruism and like in certain sorts of like parasitic organisms that seem to demonstrate altruism in some way, in the way that there's some of them get sacrificed for the larger sort of like parasitic creature, right? They try to do this, but of course then you still have to make the step from why should anybody be altruistic, and you can't do that because that involves an ethical principle, which is the thing you were trying to explain the first. We can't do it. I had a professor who was obsessed with that. He's like the expert on philosophy and biology. It's all about altruism. Anyways, that was Heraclitus. You get these other guys, some of which you've heard maybe in like, for high school math. You get Pythagoras. Pythagoras was like kind of a monist, but he sort of thought of the universe as being sort of like fundamentally mathematical, right? Parmenides, all the similar but more metaphysical than Pythagoras. Anyways, I'm gonna curtail this because after these guys, after the monists, now look, this is important. After the monists, you get this group of guys who looked at the monists and were like, look, you say that the real story, this is so important, think about the thing we've been talking about through the past 2 episodes. You say that the real story behind all of this is this deeper unity, and that's the real thing, and we should all be like focused on that. But like, man, our actual experience in the world seems to suggest otherwise. Like, what's the use in saying that there's this underlying unity if it's the particularity and the multiplicity that we are most in touch with and have to interact with and deal with and cope with and live with? Right? I can't. You may say I'm no different than you and all is one, but like, if I walk across your freshly seeded lawn, you blame me and not you. Right? Like, it's like, you know what I'm saying? Like, we don't actually, like, so these guys are like, no, all that can't be right. So these guys are called the pluralists. And just like before, there's a little succession of them slightly modifying each other's theories and saying similar and different things. But what they all have in common is that they emphasized the plurality. And by emphasized, here's what I mean. I mean, all these guys, the whole group, the pre-Socratic group, had this notion that there has to be a real story behind experience. Like, there has to be a real thing. There has to be something that explains everything. Okay? The monists say that thing is unified and one and single, right? And thus, everything itself is sort of like unified because it comes from that thing, right? The everythingness of everything comes from a one thing. So one thing is the real story. The pluralists are like, no, the everything is the real story. We get the unity of our experience because, like, I'm looking at a garage right now that seems like a unified thing, but it's really just a conglomeration of various materials, which they themselves are conglomerations of various elements, right? Which are conglomerations of atoms and electrons, right? So pick your particle. Reality at its bottom is multiplicity and plurality. And these guys were called the pluralists. Okay? So they're like, it's not one thing out of which everything comes. It's more than one. At a minimum, could be a million, could be 2, but it's more than one. It's multiplicity. So like there was this guy named Empedocles who said, well, everything comes from 4 things: air, water, earth, and fire. And just like you had to sort of like do a little bit of contortion, but then you could suddenly see how Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes said what they said, you can sort of see it here too. It's like we're trying to explain this world around us. What seems like the most if we're going to explain it in terms of stuff in it, what seems like the most basic stuff that could like somehow in some weird way be imagined to generate other stuff? Well, everything is either hot or cold, and everything is either solid or, it's like they're trying to get to like so he's like air, water, earth, fire. Everything can sort of be like hashed out of that stuff, okay? That was his idea, and then a critic comes along, and they're like, this guy's name was Anaxagoras. So we've got Anaximander, Anaxagoras, and Anaximenes. Okay, the first, all right, we got it. Anaxagoras, and he's like, okay, yeah, I get it. I agree that there's got to be that plurality has got to be basic to things, right? I get that part. I'm with you. I don't think all is one. I think all is a conglomeration of things, right? But he doesn't like the idea that, well, it's like sorry, I'm just trying to figure the best way to explain this. It's similar to what they said to Thales. They said, hey, the thing that you're explaining everything by can't itself be one of the things. Otherwise, it's not doing the job of explaining. Like, all can't be water, because water is one of the things we encounter with our senses in the physical world, and we're trying to figure out the unity behind, right? Water can't, we're just going in a circle if we say all is water. Well, Anaxagoras looked at Empedocles and he said a similar thing. He's like saying, well, look, air, water, earth, and fire are four of the things we need to explain. And this is kind of, they can't be the essences of things because we find those things in our experiences. They're what's experienced. So they can't be the explanation of the experience or the cause of the experience, right? Or saying that they are is vacuous, I should say. Okay, so I'm gonna curtail this because this could just go on and on and on and on. All right, here's the point. Well, there's 2 points, and like I said before, there's 2 points. There's what you were told about these guys, which is that for the first time, humanity is looking out into the world and wondering what's it all made of, and it's going to get real rational now about it and not appeal to. This is the scientific mind first expressing itself. Okay. And then there's this other thing that I want you to notice, I'm going to draw more attention to now, which is really interesting. And that is essentially what these guys were going back and forth about is whether the core of reality, the that from which all comes, is itself unified or multifarious or plural, right? Or right? Whether unity is the real story in reality or plurality is the real story in reality. Which to place on top of the other. And when the monists placed the unity on top, the atomists were like, that doesn't really work because this, and this. And when the atomists placed the plurality on top, then the monists can come right back and say, it doesn't really work because there has to be something tying it all together that's intelligible, right? There has to be a unity. Essentially, that's Anaxagoras' criticism of Empedocles. He's like, well, what's the unity to air, water, earth, and fire? So they keep doing this shuffle. Unity, plurality, and they can't get out of this bind. Okay. Now, if you read the scripture, if you read the Bible, you get this doctrine derived from the scriptures to the effect that God, that from which all comes, is neither fundamentally plural nor fundamentally in our sense singular, but sort of embodies unity and plurality in the Trinity. Isn't that something? But these guys kept battling back and forth with this attempt to elevate one of these things in order to solve one problem, and then needing to elevate the other one in order to solve the problems generated from elevating the one. And you just get this back and forth. And the criticisms start to look a little repetitive and predictable and reasonable to the extent that, pre-Socratic philosophy is intelligible and reasonable. But we just went through a little bit of you see the point. So that's what all these guys had in common, is that in a way they were saying all is one. Okay? So when the author opens up this piece and says that the belief that everything in the universe is part of the same fundamental whole exists through many cultures and philosophical and religious and spiritual and scientific traditions. He's right. This is the beginning of it, okay? And it's not just here in ancient Greek culture. I mean, if you look at Hinduism, what does Hinduism say? If you look at the ancient East, what does Hinduism say? Hinduism says that reality, the real story, is this universal, undifferentiated soul stuff, Brahman. And that each of us is this like instance of that's been sort of like separated from it or broken off for it. I think they call this Atman. I could be mistaken. But the undifferentiated, the unity, the more fundamental thing is the Brahman. So nirvana, right, is it that notion? There's this reaching towards this like blending into the oneness. But I have yet to attain omnipresent supergalactic oneness. See? That's Jim Carrey from one of the Ace Ventura movies. Incidentally, Jim Carrey's Twitter feed about every other tweet is something to the effect of all is one. All right. Jim Carrey, yeah, could have used him for this episode. Poor man. So I'm going to read through this article now, and I want you to see what this author does with this idea and how confusedly the concept is handled. And you can see why there's room for confusion here, because like we said, and like I've said a million times, what a person means when they say all is one totally depends on what they think, what kind of things they think can exist and do exist. Okay? So we saw the quote from Schrodinger. So I'm going to begin with the second paragraph here. And now remember what I said last episode. This whole article is going to be meant to call into question your traditional values. Okay? That's what it's meant to do. But it's meant to do it in a way that makes you receptive to it, because you don't want to be out of step with science, right? See? This is the game. This is the racket. Despite the prevalence of this belief, it says, there has been a lack of well-validated measure in psychology that captures this belief. So now we're going to scientify it. We're going to scientify it with a phony science, the phony science of psychology. While certain measures of spirituality do exist, the belief in oneness questions are typically combined with other questions that assess other aspects of spirituality, such as meaning, purpose, sacredness, or having a relationship with God. Now, you might... Right? If all is one, there is no God, my friend. Right? If all is one, then, or there is a God, but so is this. All right, that's my mouse. All right. Then he then rhetorically asks, and this is where the article's going. Okay, what would happen if we secularized this belief in oneness? And the reason this is so funny to me is if we go back to the pre-Socratics, that's what they were doing. I mean, by the common historical account, what does it mean to secularize something? It means to render it in terms of the categories of knowledge and investigation that are amenable to us, given the kind of creatures that we are or take ourselves to be in a material world. To secularize, to make it non-transcendent, right? So, and what are we told about the pre-Socratics? That for the first time, they were trying to explain the world in terms of the world, in terms of itself. And that is the fundamental impetus of the scientific mind, right? This writer asks, what would happen if we secularized the belief in oneness? In a series of studies, the article goes on. Now, this is the move. Again, like I've said several times, this is the move. You got to cite some studies, and then you got to mention some numbers. Okay, so that's what we're going to get in the next book, and then it's science. Okay. In a series of studies, Kate Diebels and Mark Leary set out to find out what happens when we secularize the belief in oneness. In their first study, they found that only 20.3% of participants had thought about the oneness of all things, often or many times. Well, you're just walking up to people on the street like, how often have you thought about the oneness of all things? Well, 25.9% of people seldom thought about the oneness of all things, and 12.5% of the people never had thought about it. And even if we knew how much they thought about it. We still wouldn't know what they think about. Why? Because what a person means when they say all is one depends on their metaphysics. And until we know what their metaphysics are, we don't know what they mean by all is one, or even what they think they mean. The researchers also created a 6-item belief in oneness scale. Oh, sorry, this is the third component of the pseudoscience or scientifying something, right? You got to have numbers, right? You got to have a study, right? And that study has to have some like measure or metric or model or scaffolding, right? So you have to have a scale of some sort that measures respondents, right? Some scale against which to measure the psychological data you're collecting. So this is the belief in oneness scale that was used to interpret or understand or stratify or hierarchize or whatever the respondents to these questions about the belief in oneness. Now, what's interesting to me is that this is called a scale. By this author's lights, this is a scale, meaning what's a scale? There's a gradation, there's an implied gradation, okay? But if you read these and you understand what we've looked at with the pre-Socratics, and you understand the notions involved in saying all is one, you understand all these are saying the exact same thing, okay? It's only to someone who hasn't like appreciated the full sort of like import, the like metaphysical and epistemological import of saying all is one, that these would seem to be different statements. They're all the same statement. So it's not a scale at all, but that's just my criticism. Never mind it. Let me just read through them real fast. Number 1, beyond surface appearance. This is a scale. So the person looks at this in the sciencey study. The person looks at this and they pick one or several of these as explaining what they mean when they say all is one, or right. And this is supposed to like measure their commitment to the notion, or how thoroughgoing is their belief in the oneness of things. But how could this be a measure of thoroughgoingness if each of these items is self-identical with the others? Okay, semantically identical, meaning they all mean the same thing. Number 1, beyond surface appearances, everything is fundamentally one. Stop me if you've heard this one. Number 2, although many seemingly separate things exist, they all are part of the same whole. Should I stop? No, there's more, but there's not more because they're all the same. Number 3, at the most basic level of reality, everything is one. Was that 3? That was 4. That was 3. Now here's number 4. The separation among individual things is an illusion. In reality, you guessed it, everything is one. Number 5, everything is composed of the same basic substance, whether one thinks of it as a spirit, consciousness, quantum processes, or whatever. Number 6, the same basic essence permeates everything that exists. Okay, so that's the belief in oneness scale through which the responses of the respondents were interpreted. Okay? Now, the article goes on. And it goes on by saying those who scored higher on the scale, and we just saw that how do you score higher on a scale where every grade, every strata is identical in meaning with the other. Okay? Never mind that now. I'm done belaboring that point. Those who scored higher on this scale were much more likely to have an identity that extends beyond the individual to encompass wider aspects of humankind, life, nature, and even the cosmos. Now, there's 2 things to say here. One is, well, yeah, if I believe that all is one, then in a sense, right? Sorry, let me nix it. Then in a sense, right, I'm likely to have an idea of identity that extends beyond the individual. Why? Because I believe that all is one and therefore individuals don't exist. That's number 1. But number 2, they're trying to say something more here. And this something more that they're trying to say is another feature of this general kind of article that I'm highlighting in this and that prior episode. All right? The game that's being played here is now we're going to mention some either positive qualities that you don't have, or negative qualities that you do, and we're going to try to associate them via this scientific information that we've taken in, right, with a metaphysics that you need to either adopt or disabuse yourself of, depending on if they were positive or negative, right? So the idea is like, you're out of step, man, okay? So here, now notice what's happening. notice that the belief hasn't happened explicitly yet, but it's coming, because it's going to logically follow or practically follow from this point about me being more open to my identity with everything else. This is going to be said to be, are you ready? More compassionate. This is the key idea. This is where the metaphysics tries to become ethics. It tries to evolve into ethics. And I know that when you hear people say this culturally, you're just used to this notion that the oneness of all things somehow implies the sacredness of all things. And so somehow compassion is a quality or a property or a characteristic that's more prevalent in people who believe in the oneness of all things. Because if all is one, then everything is... See, it's just implied that everything is... Somehow compassion is infused via the sacredness of all things. And you might think, yeah, no. Why? Think about what we said with the pre-Socratics and the opposites. Think about it. If all is one, and there's not this and that and you and me, then what does that do? Here, let me say it this way. Let me do it a different way. If differentiation is not the real story, if all is one, then differentiation is not true. Differentiation is just superficial. It's surface level, right? But what's the fundamental differentiation that is the backbone of all ethics and moral discussion? Good and evil? Huh? All right, well, guess what? That's a differentiation that cannot go to the core of reality. Why? Because all is one. So then how could compassion in any logical or practical way be thought to follow from the belief that all is one? It cannot. This is a heist. This is a philosophical heist. The jewels have just been smuggled out from under your nose, all right? It's English. There's English wax. There's French wax, Swiss wax. I don't know, what does he say? All different kinds of wax. Pink Panther. Sorry. You've been robbed. Help! Hiss! I've been robbed. You've been robbed. Look what just happened. The belief in the oneness of all things, you were just meant to... I should keep reading the article because it's going to get thicker here in a second. So right now, they've only made the point about individuals who believe this tend to view themselves as being more one with everything. It's like, yeah, no shit, thanks, right? But they're going to spin this now into an argument about compassion and the correlation between this belief and compassion. But notice what we just said. Compassion, why should I be compassionate? Should I? Is compassionate good and non-compassion evil? Or compassion good and non-compassion bad? Well, guess what? The categories of good and bad, on your own view, are part of the superficial story. Distinction and difference and opposite, those all grow out of a more fundamental thing. And you're saying that the fundamental thing doesn't make reference to those. It's blind to them. It's prior to them. So how are you going to make an ethical theory or make an ethical claim or extol or exhort people to compassion or even suggest that compassion is correlated with this belief when this belief is the denial that the principle that compassion extols is a real principle? You see? This is a problem. But look, this is what they do in these articles, and this is why I wanted to do this series. You are constantly being hoodwinked. I'm going to read I'm going to mention two books. Here, let me do it this way. I keep mentioning Hinduism, right? Because Hinduism is like the perfect sort of like, those pre-Socratic guys, like the monists, like Hinduism is like the epitome of monism. It's like, Hinduism is like all the particular individuality of things is an illusion, right? All is one, right? And we imagine sort of the Hindus being very like in touch with things and compassionate, right? This is constantly done to you. But just think about the argument, the intractable argument or the intractable problem we just posed. It's a problem. Let's go to one of the foundational texts of the Hindu religion. I mean, I don't mean to get all like anthropological. That's like, I like doing theory, right? Not the anthropology. But let's go to the text. I don't know how to say it. The Bhagavad Gita, is that right? Bhagavad Gita, something like that. This opening scene in the book has this guy, this warrior, soldier, whatever you want to call him, named Arjuna. And he's out on this battlefield and he's frozen. And he's frozen because he's scared. And he's scared because on the other hill is the other army, and they're about to, like, blood's about to be shed, and it seems like inevitable, and what, tension's building, and it's like time to fight, and it's time somebody's about to yell charge, right? And Arjuna's like standing there, in his pants, right? Or I don't mean to sound like any of us would. He's like, I don't want to do this, right? This is two families that have been at war, like, historically in this town, and like it's a big deal, right? And poof, Krishna appears to him. Okay, Krishna is, forgive me if I get this slightly wrong, but for our purposes, it's right enough. There are these instances in the Old Testament where, like, there is an appearance of the divine to a character. I'm talking about the incarnation, like with Christ. There's what they call in theology, they call them theophanies. Okay, in Christian theology, they call them theophanies, where there's this empirical, sort of like by the senses, manifestation somehow of, like, God in some degree. He, like, takes on the sort of, like, so you have, like, the burning bush. Like, God's not the burning bush, right? But he's there, it's like that, right? Or like the visitors to Abraham, or they call it a theophany. So, like, this is different, right? You might think, well, it's like that. Like, Krishna appearing to Arjuna is like that. But think about what Hinduism says, and this is not the larger point here, I just feel like it's worth making. Think about what Hinduism says is the underlying source of all things. It's undifferentiated, right? So this is not like a being behind the world with will and intention and thoughts and identity and personage stepping into the world to carry a message from here into here or interact in some way, right? This being has no individual being in that more fundamental world. It's like the ocean just becoming into, like, this character, this personage, and then blending back into the oneness of all things. There's no identity, there's no person behind it, there's no person that steps in, like in the Old Testament, okay? Because there's a God behind the world in the Old Testament. The God can step into the world he made in some capacity, right? Not maybe exhaustively reveal himself, but he can interact, right? But he can only interact because there's a he back there to interact. In Hinduism, there's not that. The core of reality is this Brahman. It's undifferent. There's no individual identities. Okay? Anyway, that's not the larger point. Here's the larger point. Krishna appears to Arjuna, and he's like, hey man, I know you're scared, but listen, you're only scared because you're deceived. And what you're deceived about is the difference between you, essentially, I mean, so many words, this is the rhetorical device, between their blood and your blood. You're thinking of you're thinking of that enemy over there as being different than you, and thus you're scared to kill them because you don't want to take lives, and you're still wrapped up in this illusion. If you only understood, and this again gets mystical, right? Monism always tends towards mysticism, right? If you only understood the oneness of all things, if you only understood the oneness of all things, you wouldn't be scared. You would just sort of understand the inexorable nature of all this, and that you're no different than that guy over there, so it's not like one lives and one dies. It's all one thing, man. So be comforted by that, Arjuna. It's like, is that going to help? No, it doesn't matter if it's going to help. The point is, if that's what's believed, right? Krishna's making a point. It's like, hey, the oneness of all things, man. So the idea that, like, I should do this to that, but not do this to that, or kill this, but let this, to treat things as different things, to make ethical ascriptions, right? It's just involved in it's not the real story. So this is the Bhagavad Gita. This is their text. This is the Hindu text, right? It teaches this lesson in like the opening, it's like the opening scene. Krishna doesn't say, hey, all is one. Here's, let me put the point. I'm sorry. Krishna doesn't say, hey, all is one, so go be compassionate to them. He says, all is one, so kill away. Why? Why not? Because the goodness and the evil that are the bedrock principles of any sort of ethical system or framework in which you would fashion an ethical decision or an ethical proposition are all part of the flux at their opposites. They don't go down to the heart of reality. They're superficial. Okay? So asserting the oneness of all reality you could in no way keep them in the picture. They're gone. Okay? So how, in the mind of this author, as you're going to see, are we going to suggest that belief in the oneness of all things somehow leads to compassion? Well, they're going to be subtle and tricky about it. They're going to say it's correlated with compassion. And what's the best explanation of that? Well, I don't know, but people tend to be more compassionate when they believe in the oneness of all things. No, they don't. But it doesn't even matter if they do. Theoretically, the two are unrelated because compassion is a moral virtue. But there's no morality if there's no good and evil. And if all is one, then there's no good and evil. Let me put the point another way. One of the first kind of pieces of philosophy I ever read was that book by C.S. Lewis called Mere Christianity. And I was kind of wowed by the opening chapter. I was really wowed by the opening chapters of the book because it was like it was more methodical than I'd never really read anything sort of so reasoned and methodical before. And he does this thing in one of the opening chapters where he's talking about the different conceptions of God the different cultures have had. And he mentions Hinduism, and his comments on Hinduism are sort of really helpful in understanding this point that I'm making about Arjuna and Krishna on the battlefield in the opening chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, which is in turn meant to defuse and defang and show you expose the foolishness and the folly of this author's coming suggestion that compassion or the belief in oneness of all things is somehow conducive of or causal towards compassion. It's nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. So I've tried to use the Bhagavad Gita story to explain why, but let me use this also as a way of explaining why. He talks about people who don't believe in God and people who do believe in God. But then he says, but just leave the people who don't believe in God for a second. Let's just talk about people who do believe in God. Okay? He says they can be divided further into the sort of God that they believe in. He says there's two very different ideas and I'm not endorsing all of this. Okay? I would tend to endorse like 99% of what this guy says, but I don't endorse all. I just want you to appreciate the point that he makes about this belief in oneness. Says there's two very ideas on this subject. One of them is the idea that God is beyond good and evil. We humans call one thing good and another thing bad, but according to some people, that's merely our human point of view. These people would say that the wiser you become, the less you would want to call anything good or bad, and the more dearly you would see, the more clearly you would see that everything is good in one way and bad in another, and that nothing could have been different. Consequently, these people think that long before you got anywhere near the divine point of view, the distinction would have disappeared altogether. We call a cancer bad, they say, because it kills a man, but you might just as well call a successful surgeon bad because he kills the cancer. It all depends on the point of view. See? And this is because, later he goes on to say, and this is pantheism, right? And Hinduism is a pantheist. Pantheism is just a belief that all is one. All right. Does it make sense? So if unity and sameness is the real story, which is effectively just what you mean when you say all is one, then difference and plurality is superficial and an illusion. Well, then we lose the distinction between good and evil, and then we can make no moral claims. So what are we talking about when we try to suggest that oneness leads to compassion? Arjuna says, all is one, go kill those guys. And you can make no better argument for why Arjuna should do that than why he shouldn't, and no better for why he shouldn't than why he should, because you would have to posit some sort of moral reality in order to make the argument. But that's just what this view denies. Anyway, let's keep reading the article. We're almost done. I just have like one or two more things to say. Those who scored higher on the scale were much more likely to... Okay, so he's going to make the move. He's going to make the move from just, we tended to find that they had a wider sense of identity than other people, right? So they're going to be extolled. You're going to be denigrated as the person who's tribal and insular, and it's because you're conservative. It's because you don't believe in the oneness of all things. It's just a game. It's just propaganda, but I just want you to see how it works. He says, those who scored higher on this belief were much more likely to have an identity that extends beyond the individual to encompass wider aspects of humankind, life, nature, and even the cosmos. In fact, a belief in oneness was more strongly related to feeling connected with distant people. Yeah. So it's always the people who feel the most connected with people they never have to interact with. Right. In fact, a belief in oneness was more strongly related to feeling connected with distant people and aspects of the natural world than with people with whom one is close. Also, while a belief in oneness was related to actual experiences of oneness, like mystical experiences, there was no relationship between a belief in oneness and feeling closer to God during a spiritual experience. Yeah, this author's so confused because by definition, a belief in oneness would be the denial of any sort of God you could get in contact with beyond experience. He's got a PhD. This guy's got a PhD. In their second study, the researchers looked at values and self-views that might be related to belief in oneness. They found that a belief in oneness was related to values indicating a universal concern for the welfare of other people, as well as greater compassion for other people. I told you this was coming. See, and it's suggested, the correlation is suggested to you, and and because of the correlation, which they've just selectively, right? We need to know, are these people really compassionate? Who are they compassionate towards? How is compassion measured, right? Who count, actions towards whom count as compassionate actions? What actions count as compassionate actions? Where is this concept of compassion coming from and how is it established, right? Right? Who's governing all these concepts? That's what we need. But the correlation is put forward to you by, this is the game, this is the racket. The correlation is put forward to you by the selective using of studies with these bogus models, right? And then you're meant to make the inference from, oh yeah, well naturally if I believe that all is one and one is all, then I would be more compassionate. So my belief, stemming from my Western tradition, that all is not one, that there is a God, a good God behind the universe, who is not part of this universe, who is not part of the same kind of being that I am. He's not floating in the same pool as me. He doesn't have the same questions as I have. He's the answer to those questions, right? Like, right? That kind of thing can't be. And that's the reason I'm non-compassionate. And that's the reason I believe in individual rights and not killing babies. And that's hey, I'm not joking. That's where all this goes. Okay? This universal concern is just a philosophical veil for collectivism, socialism. That's what all of this work is doing. Okay? Got a fighter jet going over. It's not compassionate. Military is not compassionate. Strong defense, not compassionate. In their second study, researchers looked at values and self-views that might be related to the belief in oneness. They found that a belief in oneness was related to values indicating a universal concern for the welfare of other people as well as greater compassion for other people. A belief in oneness was also associated with feeling connected to others through a recognition of our common humanity, common problems, and common imperfections. And here I would just have us recur to the observation that we made at the beginning of last episode when those two quotes were juxtaposed between the Dalai Lama and Einstein. They're talking at two totally different metaphysical levels. Einstein is literally saying all is one, like the Hindu says all is one. The Dalai Lama is just saying us being what we are, we have the same kind of concerns, so we should be nicer to each other, which is a very reasonable thing to say, right? But the two are conflated, like the one involves the other, and if you believe the first stronger. And if you believe what Einstein says, you'll be more like the Dalai Lama, right? And you'll be less like Donald Trump. At the same, okay, I think I read all that. There's this. Then you're thrown a bone. They always throw you a bone, okay? So that you don't have to stop thinking everything you think. Right? So here's what it says at the end. At the same time, there was no relationship between a belief in oneness and the degree to which people endorsed self-focused values such as hedonism, self-direction, security, or achievement. This means that people can have a belief in oneness and still have a great deal of self-care, healthy boundaries, and self-direction. So in other words, no, this isn't about eradicating Western religious notions and thus Western political institutions. This is just about oneness, man. You can still keep individualism. No, that's not what this is about. The last section is called Implications of a Belief in Oneness. And in a sense, I don't need to read this because I've already given you the actual, and the Bhagavad Gita has given you the actual implications of a belief in oneness. You lose the ability to make all distinction, and thus all of your life that involves distinctions becomes false in a way. Can you live like that? Like I said, when I trample your lawn, you don't blame yourself, you blame me, right? But we're the same, man. Implications of a belief in oneness. People who believe that everything is fundamentally one differ in crucial ways from those who do not. In general, those who hold a belief in oneness have a more inclusive identity that reflects their sense of connection with other people, non-human animals, except for unborn babies, and aspects of nature that are all thought to be part of the same. Do you think I'm joking here? You think I'm joking here? Look, the moral theory that is used to justify, vindicate, whatever you want to call it, the ethical nature, the alleged ethical nature of abortion, the moral theory that is used to do that, or the set of arguments that exemplify the moral theory that's used to do that, have this same sort of flavor, all is one flavor, and perspectival and relativistic flavor to them. And they come from Hume. And Hume's philosophy, when you look at it, looks very much like Buddhism. If you just stripped all the mystical stuff out of Buddhism, you have an epistemology that looks a lot like David Hume, which is where you get the ethics that justify abortion. All right, all this stuff is related. Okay. People who believe that everything is fundamental. People believe that everything is fundamentally one differ in crucial ways from those who do not. In general, those who hold a belief in oneness have a more inclusive identity that reflects their sense of connection with others. And what does it even mean to have an inclusive identity? Who doubts that we're all people? Who doubts that we all have a common nature? Who doubts that if you prick us, do we not bleed? No one doubts that, right? Yeah, I almost want to do a part 3 here, because what ends up happening in this last section is that there's another sort of inversion that happens where the very sort of ethical considerations that grow out of the worldview that countenances and acknowledges individual identities, namely the Western notion that believes that each person is different and unique and has value and has dignity thereby, that we're not all one, that the important thing isn't that out of which we come, isn't the collective, isn't the mass, isn't the solid, undifferentiated thing at the center that spins out into the individuality. It's the individual things. Those are the important things. Those are the things with moral dignity. Those are the things with moral value. Those are things with inviolable moral rights, right? Those things have meaning unto themselves, significance unto themselves, rights that apply to them unto themselves, right? But what's done at the end of this article is like this judo whereby all those things are said to follow from a belief in oneness, right? And this sort of inhumane, it's always like this inhumane curmudgeonliness is attributed to the opposite view. I'll just read it. It's like 2 more paragraphs. People believe that everything is fundamentally one, differ in crucial ways from those who do not. In general, those who hold a belief in oneness have a more inclusive identity that reflects their sense of connection with other people, non-human animals, not unborn babies or recently born babies, and aspects of nature that are all thought to be part of the one thing. This has some rather broad implications. Now look, that doesn't matter. First of all, there's a question of whether it's true, what it means. It's probably meaningless. It's probably based on very limited notions of the concept of all. It doesn't matter. We just showed that the notion of the oneness of things can't rationally support the moral point of view. Right? That's the point about the story in the Bhagavad Gita. That was Lewis's point. It's like you can't build a moral framework and thus make moral claims on top of this notion that all is one, because moral claims involve values, distinctions between good and evil that are taken to be real distinctions, thus the importance of the moral claim, the substance of the moral claims. But if those distinctions are superficial, if good and evil are superficial distinctions that once you got to the core of reality didn't really apply, all bets are off. And that was Krishna's point to Arjuna. It's like saying, don't worry about it, man. So it's not like all is one, therefore compassion, because Krishna's like all is one, therefore charge. The article goes on. First, this finding is relevant to our current fractured political landscape. See, now and this is the final piece. Right? This is what I've told you. All these things exist to do. We with science, we get our categories confused, and we present certain limited selected scientific findings in this way that shapes them for how we want to apply them later. And then we call out some beliefs that we think that we know that you have, but we're saying just generally all of us might have, that we might want to revise in light of these findings, right? And then we suggest that, then we make the stronger suggestion about who and what needs to change. It's just the same thing in every article, and it's all such nonsense. So now we're going to go on to here's another inversion. We're going to go on to this being the lack of belief in oneness being an explanation of the polarization of our political landscape, right? The polarization of our political landscape is just a reality that follows from the fact that one side has lost their goddamn minds. That's all the polarization is, insofar as you want to talk about polarization, right? It's not a mystery. You've lost your goddamn mind. So now we appear to be really polarized because you've fallen into the abyss. And you've literally fallen into abyss because you believe that moral categories don't go to the heart of reality, and therefore they can have no moral import. Therefore they can have no argumentative force. That's why you believe that everything is okay except for believing that some things are not okay. That's why we're polarized, because you've lost your goddamn mind. Anyway, here's the trick, here's the game, here's the wrap-up. First, this finding is relevant to our current fractured political landscape. It's very interesting that those who reported a greater belief in oneness were also more likely to regard other people like members of their own group and identify with all of humanity. Not what Krishna said to Arjuna. And it doesn't matter. Because the correlation is not causation, and it's not logical connection. We've just shown that there's no logical connection. But they give you the correlation here. They fine-tune and create the correlation by the way they present these findings and the way they structure the study. They create these correlations, and they say, you might want to consider that this correlation is because oneness leads to compassion, and therefore you're not compassionate. There's an abundance of identity politics these days. This is what's so bizarre about this. Who's engaged in identity politics? Right? See the inversion here? Isn't this insane? There's an abundance of identity politics these days. What is the conservative argument against? Think about the Dalai Lama quote here. What is the conservative argument against the whole idea of identity politics? Don't break people up into a plurality of different kinds of things, because we are all the same kind of thing and have the same kind of rights and have the same concerns and the same general life concerns, and right? Unity. See? Do you see the inversion here? But here it's being made to sound as if not believing in the oneness of all things is a cause of identity politics. Isn't it amazing? It's very interesting that those who reported a greater belief in oneness were also more likely to regard other people like members of their own group and identify with all of humanity. There's an abundance of identity politics these days, with people believing that their own ideology is the best one. Are you saying it's not the best one, or are you saying there's not a best one? Right? If you're saying there's not a best one, that would at least be consistent with the belief that all is one, because like we said, moral categories and distinctions can't go to the heart of that world if the world's like that. So it wouldn't make any sense to say that any ideology is better than another. But then if no ideology is better than another, then why should we take any scientific findings in stride and assess and assimilate into maybe fashioning a new ideology or changing ideologies or modifying our ideology? I could do this all day. There's an abundance of identity politics these days, with people believing that their own ideology is the best one, and believe that those who disagree with one's own ideology are evil or somehow less than human. Who thinks that? Anyways, it goes on, it closes, I think, here. It might be beneficial for people all across the political spectrum. Here's the generalization. Oh, I'm just talking to everybody. It might be beneficial for people all across the political spectrum to recognize and hold in mind a belief in oneness, even as they are asserting their values and political beliefs. Only having compassion for those who are in your in-group and vilifying or even becoming violent towards those who you perceive as the out-group is not only antithetical to world peace more broadly, but is also counterproductive to the political progress that advances the greater good of all humans on this planet. So here again, you're impeding human progress by not being compassionate, by not embracing this metaphysic that suggests that all values, all moral values and all moral categories are superficial, right? There's one more paragraph. I don't think I can finish it. I just wanted to highlight again the general type of article that appears on this site, getpocket.com. I don't know if I'll get sick of this. There's hundreds of these. It's good fodder. But that's sort of the story on the statement, all is one. The main takeaway is that it's been said ever since people started theorizing. It has certain consequences. It grows out of certain considerations. It has certain consequences. And one of the consequences it has is that all distinction is superficial. And you cannot say anything of a moral and thus of a social or political nature after you have said that all distinctions are superficial. Because any claim or recommendation or exhortation or maxim or anything you wanted to propound after that would involve the very distinctions that you're now saying are superficial. So we just used the Bhagavad Gita to sort of illustrate that point. They're saying this leads to compassion. In the ancient Hindu text, it seems to be a reason to do whatever. And that's the logically consistent point. Because after all, you're no different than that thing over there. Your fear of killing it is part of your delusion in thinking that it's a separate thing than you. The only real thing is the one thing, the all of this. Right, Jim Carrey? This has been episode 50, I think. I think it's been episode 50. We'll see you next time.